Today we are going to discuss about pure interpretation and hybrid implementation techniques in programming languages. Pure interpretation and hybrid implementation in programming languages. So what is meant by pure interpretation? A pure interpreter reads the source text of a program, analyzes it and executes it as it goes. The source code is translated into the machine code for a particular CPU, one instruction at a time and executed immediately. The source code is translated into machine code for a particular CPU, one instruction at a time and executes immediately. It reads one instruction at a time and it will execute it immediately. There are actually three primary modes of interpreting. One is consecutive interpreting, simultaneous interpreting and cited translation interpretation. So what is meant by consecutive interpreting? The interpreter speaks after the source language speaker has stopped speaking. So then that kind of interpreting is called as consecutive interpreting. The consecutive interpreting is nothing but interpretation. The interpreter speaks after the source language speaker has stopped speaking. And another kind of one is simultaneous interpreting. The interpreter listens and renders the message in the target language at the same time as the speaker is speaking. So it will done simultaneously. Interpreting done simultaneously when the speaker is speaking. So the simultaneous interpreting is that the interpreter listens and renders the message in the target language at the same time as the speaker is speaking. So another kind of interpretation is a cited transition. So an oral rendition of a written text is called as cited translation. Cited translation interpretation is nothing but an oral rendition of a written text. Now let us understand what is the purpose of interpretation. The purpose behind interpretation is to clarify the meaning of the words used in the statutes which might not be that clear. The purpose behind the interpretation is to clarify the meaning of the words that are used in the statutes which might not be that much of clear. According to the interpretation is the process by which the court seeks to ascertain the meaning of the language used through the medium of authoritative forms in which it is expressed. Now, what is meant by good interpretation? A good interpretation involves listening, understanding, and communicating the message all at the same time. So, a good interpretation involves listening and communicating the message all at the same time. Hence, the interpreter must be adept in cognitive and analytical skills, keeping the deadline in mind. This will make it easy for interpreter to make people understand more effectively. So, for the qualities or the characteristics of listening, understanding, and communicating the message at a time makes easy for the interpreter to make people understand more effectively. So here is the diagram which represents the process of pure interpretation. So our source program is given to the interpreter and input is also given to the interpreter, and it processes the program and input data and gives the results. So the pure interpretation gives immediate feedback about errors, and it will give some slower execution because it will check for the errors line by line. Often requires more space for execution, more space for storage. Now let us understand the advantages. So pure interpretation process will be like this. So source is given to interpreter and input is also given to interpreter, and it will produce the result. Immediate feedback about errors will be produced by the pure interpreter process, and the execution may be little slower than other processes. Often it requires more space for storage. The main advantages of implementing programming languages using pure interpreter is that a pure interpreter allows for implementation of many source level debugging operations. It allows for implementation of many source level debugging operations because many runtime error messages can be referred to source level units only. Along with an advantage, there is a disadvantage also with the pure interpreter. What is that? Is the biggest disadvantage with this is slower than the compiled code. This is because the interpreter has to analyze and convert each line of source code, that is each line of byte code, into machine code before it can be executed. That's why it takes more time for execution. So the speed of the interpreter system is very slow. That is the disadvantage with interpreter process. Now the other one is hybrid implementation process. The hybrid implementation process is a combination of compilers and pure interpreters. Here is the diagram which represents hybrid interpreters, which contains source program, lexical analyzers, and lexical analyzers which produce lexical units, and lexical units again put into syntax analyzers. Syntax analyzers produce parse trees, and those parse trees generate intermediate code generator. That intermediate code can be passed to the interpreter, and that interpreter will give the result with the combination of, while taking the input into it, and by executing all this together, the interpreter will produce the result. So a hybrid implementation is a combination of compilers and pure interpreters. It is a high level language program translated to an intermediate language that allows easy interpretation. So hybrid implementation is faster than pure interpretation because it uses both compilers and pure interpreters also for execution. Example for hybrid implementation is Java platform is an example for hybrid implementation. Java is a both compiled and interpreted language. It uses just-in-time implementation system. Java uses just-in-time implementation system. What is meant by just-in-time implementation systems? It initially translates program into an intermediate language, then compiled intermediate language into the machine code. Machine code version is kept for the subsequent calls. Then JIT systems are hence JIT systems are widely used for Java programs. Why? Because first they can be converted into intermediate language, then that intermediate language can be converted into machine code. Machine code version is kept for the subsequent calls. That makes the faster execution of the program. Hence, JIT systems are widely used for Java programs. .NET languages are implemented with JIT systems.